Hey everyone, I am Leah Koenig and I am here to show you how to make Rugelach. Rugelach are probably one of the most recognizable cookies in the Yiddish Jewish pastry canon. And interestingly, they're actually more of an American creation in the way that we know them than people give them credit for. They are related to a cookie called a kipfel, which is actually a kind of a category of pastries that was eaten in Eastern Europe. But the addition of cream cheese into the dough is a distinctly American addition. And so I kind of think of them as a fun Ashkenazi American hybrid cookie. So let's get into making them. You want to start with basically equal parts butter and cream cheese, and I believe it's about 8 ounces of each. And you want them to be, incredibly room temperature. Sometimes I use my microwave if I have forgotten to soften my butter. I just microwave it for about 20 seconds, and it gets it to the same place. And there's no eggs in this dough, which is it makes it sort of interesting. It's almost not quite shortbready, but I would say sort of like almost croissant textured when they're finished. And the reason that happens is the fat kind of permeates through the dough in this really nice way. So you don't need eggs. You just kind of have a delicious creamy dough that way. So now that we have our cream cheese and our butter in the mixer, we're gonna let it go at medium-high speed for about 2 minutes. And we're going to add the sugar as well. Some Rugelach doughs actually don't have any sugar in them at all, and all of the sweetness kind of comes from the topping and the filling. They often have sort of a mixture of cinnamon sugar sprinkled over the top, but I really like to add just a little bit of sugar into the dough, which I find kind of like bridges the gap for an American eater eating this cookie. I think Americans expect sweetness, and so I put in just a tiny bit of sugar. I have also used powdered sugar or like icing sugar, which I find really kind of incorporates really nicely. And as with anything, you want to stop and scrape along the way. There we go. Just to make sure that everything is getting well incorporated, you want to scrape it down. And you can make this dough by hand if you want, but you really have to get your arm muscles going to make it get to the right consistency. So a mixer, even an electric mixer, like a hand mixer instead of a stand mixer, would work fine. So while that's going, I'm going to take the salt and add it into the flour, just so it makes it kind of a little bit easier to incorporate later. So I'm just going to stir it around. So when I'm adding the flour, it will all incorporate at the same time. And I also have vanilla, which I'm going to add in. You could play around with using a little almond extract if you like that flavor, but I like the kind of more classic vanilla. Once you have the butter and the sugar and the cream cheese kind of all together, you want to add your flour in a couple of stages. And you just want to maybe do like 2, possibly 3, and you want to let it mix at a much lower speed or you'll get flour everywhere, which is not ideal. So we're going to do it at a slow speed. And the texture that you're going for is firm but still pliable. So this dough is going to spend about 2 hours in the fridge just so the butter has a chance to kind of firm up and it makes it easier to roll out. You can also prep the dough up to a day ahead. If you kind of, are cooking with kids, it's a good thing to do to make the dough in advance, let the dough sit, and then when you're bringing your kids into the process, the dough's kind of already ready to go. Or if you're just entertaining and kind of want to do things in advance. Okay, so we are going to take a peek. This dough is looking pretty good, and I'm going to take this out. And what you want to do is separate it into 2 different discs and wrap those up and kind of chill them so that they're easier to roll out later. We have our dough in the bowl, and what I like to do sometimes is use my hands to kind of just, bring it together and knead it a couple of times in the bowl. And then I'm going to divide it into 2 different discs. And I use Saran wrap to kind of help me with this part since it still is a little bit on the wet side before it goes into the refrigerator. And you're just going to wrap them up like little presents. So what I do is I wrap it and then I kind of give it a little pat so it comes out to all the edges. And then from there, I just stick these in the fridge and let them chill for about 2 hours. So after about 2 hours have passed, your dough will be a much different consistency. It's much firmer. You do want to work fairly quickly because the dough will warm up in your kitchen, especially if it's a summer day. I tend to find that it's harder to make doughs like this on summer days. And when that happens, what I do is I just pop it back into the fridge as necessary to refirm if things get a little too mushy. But so let's talk about our filling. There's many different ways you can fill Rugelach. Chocolate spread, but one of my favorite ones is a mixture of nuts, brown sugar, cinnamon, and apricot jam as sort of the binder. So what I have in here is walnuts, pecans, cinnamon, and brown sugar. The nuts get chopped up. You can do it in your food processor. You can do it manually on a cutting board, whatever you like. But you want them to be kind of uniform, but also quite small, because when you're rolling up the cookies, if you have larger pieces, they kind of fall out and get lumpy in the dough. So you want to avoid that. I also sometimes add mini chocolate chips. Because why not? It's delicious. So when you're rolling out your dough, you want to put a decent amount of flour onto the board that you're going to work on because it is a rather wet dough. So you just want to, you don't want to over flour it, but there's not too much of a risk of that with this particular dough. And you're going to start at the center and kind of roll out. Sometimes I actually also flour my rolling pin and even flour the surface of the dough. And what you want to do is make a circle. The secret about Rugelach is we're actually making pizza before we make Rugelach, and you'll see what I mean in a second. But the ideal shape is about a 12-inch circle. When you first take the dough out of the refrigerator, it can be a little bit hard to roll because it is so firm, so you kind of want to find that happy medium. And if it splits a little along the way, you just kind of put it back together with your fingers. And you're aiming for circle or circle-ish. I don't think that my bubby or great bubby making these were working with the same perfection mindset that maybe someone in my generation has. So you can be kind to yourself while you're making them. Sometimes I like to just make sure there's still flour underneath, or I even flip the dough to make sure that it's not getting too floury on one side or the other. And just keep working from the center, fixing any tears along the way until you have approximately a 12-inch circle. And the dough should be about between 1/4 and 1/8 inch thick. So I actually like to use a measuring tape to make sure I'm at the right size. This is about 11 by 11, so I'm going to go a little bit thinner. You can sort of start to see the pizza dough emerging. And once I have the dough rolled out, I like to use a knife just to trim off any ragged edges. You can even, re-roll these if you want and make like 1 or 2 extra cookies, but you don't have to. If you want, you could, you want to be really precise, you can get a 12-inch pie plate and use it to get like a perfect circumference, but when I'm cooking at home, I rarely do that. Okay, so we've got our dough. It's looking beautiful. And we're going to take our apricot jam. You can use raspberry, really any flavor you like. And this is sort of akin to our pizza sauce if we're going with that pizza metaphor. And I use an offset spatula. You can use a knife, whatever you have. In moments of desperation, I think I've even used my hands just to spread it out. So whatever works. And you want to get a nice thin layer that goes almost all the way. I need a little more than that. But you want to leave about 1/4 to 1/2 inch on the sides all around, just so you're not going flush up to the edge. Okay, so you're going to take half of your mixture, your nut and brown sugar and cinnamon mixture, because remember you have another disc of dough in the fridge that's hanging out in there till you're ready, finished with this one. And I like to kind of use my hands to sort of almost press it in a little bit, make sure it sticks. Okay, so from here you want to get 16 cookies out of each circle. And so the way I like to do that is cut the dough in half and then in quarters. And then each quarter I cut into 4 different pieces, so you end up with 16. And again, you could get super precise, but I don't think it's really necessary unless you're making these for the Queen of England or something. And so what I just did was I started from the very edge and I rolled to the middle. And you end up with this beautiful little cookie that you can, for the longer ones, if you have bigger ones, you can kind of make them into little crescents. And the smaller ones, you can try to do that too. And you're just going to keep cutting and rolling until you end up with 16 beautiful cookies. I feel like people sometimes get a little mystified by how Rugelach are made. And once they see it, they're like, oh, that makes so much more sense. And the other thing that I like about these is once you've egg washed them and sprinkled the cinnamon sugar and allowed them to bake, they kind of puff up and get really crisp, but they don't expand this way. So you can actually, wide ways, so you can actually put them quite close on the baking sheet. So I'm just gonna cut, again, my quarter into 4 pieces and roll them up. And you can see why if you are adding something like chocolate chips or maybe raisins or cranberries, it's nice to kind of use mini chocolate chips or cut the raisins or cranberries, chop them so that they roll easily. Okay. So Rugelach are eaten, there's a couple of different kind of times of year that they are eaten. One is actually Hanukkah, where foods made with dairy are actually kind of more common traditionally. And then there's also a holiday, Shavuot or Shavuos, where they're also eaten. But I actually like to serve them on the holiday of Purim in addition to Haman Tashin. I feel like it's nice if you're giving cookies to a friend, then you can give them a little bit of variety. And I also find they're just they freeze really well, so I really like to keep some in the freezer, and they thaw quite quickly, or you can put them in a toaster oven. So if you have friends drop by, you kind of have a stash of cookies waiting for you. All right, so the last step before these go into the oven is they get a little bit of an egg wash. And the egg wash helps to make the cinnamon and sugar I'm gonna sprinkle on the top stick. And it also gives them a little bit more of a nice brown sheen. I always tell my son when we're egg washing anything, make sure that you don't have egg omelets on your baking sheet, which means too many pools of egg. So you kind of just want a nice thin layer. He's 5, so he wants to just dump it. And going to make sure they all get coated on all sides. This is a nice brush because it kind of does the whole thing at once. Okay. And the mixture of cinnamon and sugar is, you can really play around with how much cinnamon and sugar you want. I tend to do more sugar than cinnamon because I find the cinnamon flavor gets a little overpowering, but you can play around with your ratios if you like a more cinnamony or less cinnamony cookie. And so the very last step is just be like Salt Bae, but with sugar. And, you know, shower your cookies with cinnamon and sugar. To me, this is what gives them that kind of classic, you know, Yiddish homey taste. Even if it is sort of an Americanized version of that homey taste, that works too. And then we'll get these guys into the oven. And they'll hang out there for, I think it's about 30, 35 minutes. And you want to check them because they can burn pretty quickly because of the jam. So you just want to make sure that you're catching them right at that golden moment before the jam has burnt. One other thing to be sure that you do is as soon as they come out of the oven, you transfer them to the wire rack because the jam basically turns into glue if you let it sit on your parchment for too long. So you want to just make sure you get them off and cooling as quickly as possible. So here we are with our beautiful little roogies, as I call them, or Rugelach. And we're going to try one, but I wish I could express the smell and share that into the camera because it really just perfumes your whole house with the scent of butter and sugar and cinnamon, and it's really just one of the most kind of nostalgic scents for me, and just thinking about like growing up and eating these as a kid. So let's try one. They are so delicious, and if my son was here he would eat the whole plate, but he's not, so they get to be mine. And I hope you enjoy when you make them at home and that you give them a try because they're really not that hard. Thanks.
If you'd like to try this dish at home, check out the recipes included in the course.